They say life can always throw you a curveball, no matter how old you are. I've always thought that one day I'd have it all figured out, with a chill routine, no drama, and no stress from all the to-dos of being young. But maybe life isn't like that. Maybe there are surprises that hit us, making us rethink what we thought we knew. My name's Eileen, and I'm 63. After a career as a school principal and having 2 great kids, I figured I knew who I was. My spouse left 5 years ago. Since then, I've gotten into a routine of quiet mornings, walks, gardening, and keeping up with family. I thought I'd left excitement behind. I thought I'd left excitement and spontaneity behind in my youth, but something changed recently in ways I can't quite understand. It began so gently that I hardly noticed, a lingering gaze, a quiet moment, a connection that seemed harmless until it wasn't. My son, Adam, has a buddy named Caleb who has been close to our family for many years. He was like a son to me. I had always trusted and respected him, but something changed in the span of one day. There was stillness between us that felt strange, like something unspoken that neither of us knew how to confront. Looking back, it's hard to comprehend how a lifetime of stability and self-assurance could I trusted and respected Neil, and he was like a son to me. One day, though, something changed. There was stillness between us that felt strange. It was like something unspoken that neither of us knew how to deal with. Looking back, it's hard to understand how a lifetime of stability and self-assurance could suddenly make me feel so fragile and vulnerable to doubt. I've been wondering what happened that day and why. I'm still thinking about it. This is my story, but my life isn't. It's not exceptional, but I like it. After over 30 years as a school administrator, I decided to retire. I've always felt really lucky to have such a close friendship with Adam and Caleb, but lately I've been feeling really fragile and vulnerable to doubt. I can't stop thinking about what happened that day and why. I'm not sure what's going on in my life, but I'm happy with it. After over 30 years as a school administrator, I decided to retire and finally have some peace and quiet with my husband. Neil passed away 5 years ago. He was a solid, compassionate man, and despite our differences, we loved one another dearly. Losing him was difficult, but I found strength in my everyday routines and close ties with our children, particularly my son, Adam. Adam, 35, is dependable. I've had a great career in engineering, and his steadiness and determination remind me a lot of Neil. Caleb is considerate and courteous, with a quiet, contemplative nature that makes people feel comfortable around him. I've always felt very fortunate to see Adam and Caleb remain close over the years. Caleb's presence brings a different energy to the house, a steady calmness, which I really appreciate. After I finished up some gardening, I decided to reward myself with a cup of tea and a relaxing day at home. Adam was out of town for a meeting, and the house was quiet. Just as I was about to sit down, I heard a knock. I told Caleb said it was nice to see him so happy about the surprise visit. If he wasn't in a rush, he should come inside and feel free to stay for tea. He paused, then nodded. I said, I'd enjoy that. It has been a while. We settled into the living room. After I had a chance to unwind, we started talking for a few minutes. Caleb said it was nice to see me so happy about the surprise visit. If you're not in a rush, come inside and feel free to stay for tea. He paused, then nodded. I'd enjoy that. It has been a while. We settled into the living room after I had had a chance to unwind. For the first few minutes, our conversation was light. We talked about work, family, and life in general, but something about the atmosphere felt different. Maybe it was the quietness of the empty house or the relaxed tone of our conversation. But I started to feel an unusual sense of ease around him as I handed him a cup of tea. Our fingers replied, and he quickly pulled. We were talking about work, family, and life in general, but something about the atmosphere felt different. Maybe it was the quietness of the empty house or the relaxed tone of our conversation, but I started to feel an unusual sense of ease around him as I handed him a cup of tea. He quickly pulled my hand back, smiling sheepishly. There was a silent moment of mutual discomfort in which neither of us knew what to say. It was a little gesture, simply a hand on my knee, and a moment of uncertainty, but something changed in that brief second. I felt warmth and awareness between us that I hadn't anticipated. I felt a connection. I smiled awkwardly and gestured back, and there was a brief moment of awkwardness where we didn't know what to say. It was just a hand on my shoulder and a moment of uncertainty, but something changed in that brief second. I felt warmth and awareness between us that I hadn't anticipated. It was more than just friendship. I brushed it off as my imagination, convincing myself that it was just a momentary lapse, a result of the stillness of the afternoon. But as we continued chatting, I found myself becoming more aware of his presence, noticing the small things, like the way he leaned forward when I spoke. That went beyond just being friendly. I brushed it off as my imagination, telling myself it was just a momentary lapse caused by the quiet afternoon. But as we kept chatting, I noticed more and more how he was there. I saw the little things, like the way he leaned forward when I spoke. I even noticed the quiet laughter and the warmth in his gaze. It felt like an invisible line had been drawn between us, something neither of us acknowledged, but both sensed. By the time Caleb left, I had this weird feeling and awareness of him that I hadn't had before. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. His quiet laughter, the warmth in his gaze. It felt like an invisible line had been drawn between us, something that neither of us acknowledged, but both sensed. By the time Caleb left, I was left with an odd feeling and awareness of him that hadn't been there before. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing but the memory, leaving me with a strange sense of anticipation and confusion. In the days that followed, I couldn't quite forget that afternoon with Caleb, despite my attempts to dismiss it as a simple interaction. The memory of his touch, his gaze, and the quiet intensity in his eyes remained with me. I felt kind of silly for thinking about it, and for letting my mind wander to weird places. Caleb was like family to Adam, someone I'd watched grow from a college student to a respected professional, but I couldn't deny the small thrill I felt in his presence. I felt warm and comfortable around him, and that feeling lingered long after he left. I felt silly for even thinking about it, and I let my mind wander to some strange places. Caleb was like family to Adam, someone I'd watched grow from a college student to a respected professional. But I couldn't deny the small thrill I'd felt in his presence. I felt warm and comfortable around him, and that feeling lingered long after he'd left. After he left, I found myself wondering if he'd felt it too or if it was simply my imagination. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. But the feeling lingered like an unanswered question at the back of my mind. A week later, Caleb stopped by again. This time, he was there to return a book. He seemed relaxed, so I invited him to sit for a while. I felt the same warmth I'd felt before. We talked easily, going from light topics to more personal ones. He told me about his career, his thoughts on moving forward, and the challenges he faced. I felt proud, like a mom watching her kid grow up, but there was something else, too. I could tell he was paying close attention to me, and the connection between us felt natural, but also a little weird. Over time, our conversations got more personal, and with each meeting, I felt the tension growing, but it was subtle. It was a quiet understanding that neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. I told myself it was nothing, simple friendship, but deep down, I knew there was something more. It was a feeling I hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to handle. Over the next few weeks, I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Caleb started coming over more often, and every time he stopped by, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt. I loved his company and looked forward to our chats, and the warmth and understanding he brought into my life was really appreciated, but I was also becoming more uneasy. There was a quiet fear that I was going too far, allowing myself. Caleb's visits got more and more frequent, and every time he came over, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt. I loved his company and looked forward to our chats, and he brought a lot of warmth and understanding into my life. But I was also becoming more uneasy. There was a quiet fear that I was going too far by developing feelings that weren't appropriate for our relationship. One evening, as we sat in the living room discussing an old family photo album, I realized just how much I'd come to enjoy his presence. We laughed over memories and shared stories, and for a moment, I felt a sense of companionship I hadn't felt in years. But then, as he leaned in to look at a photo, his arm brushed against mine, and I felt my heart race. It was such a small thing, a connection, but the proximity and the warmth of his touch sent a thrill through me. I couldn't ignore it. We looked at each other, and for a second, I felt this connection that went beyond friendship. It was like a quiet, unspoken bond. I felt excited and terrified. I knew I had to stop this before things went any further, but every time I tried to convince myself, I felt a pang of regret and longing for the comfort and warmth he brought to my life every time I tried to end our meetings. I couldn't deny the loneliness I'd felt since Neil's passing, the quiet ache that had become part of my everyday existence. Caleb's presence filled that void and brought a sense of companionship and understanding. I hadn't realized I needed that, and even though I knew my feelings were a bit weird, I couldn't bring myself to let go. One evening, when Adam was still out of town, Caleb came by to drop off some groceries he'd picked up for me, and I invited him to come more often. I hadn't realized I needed Caleb until I saw how he made me feel. I knew I shouldn't be, but I couldn't let go of the connection I felt with him. One evening, while Adam was still out of town, Caleb came by to drop off some groceries he'd picked up for me, and I invited him to stay more. He told me about his struggles with his son and how hard it was for him to balance his career with his personal life. I listened, and I could tell that I understood him. At one point, as I was washing dishes, I felt Caleb's hand on my shoulder. It was a light touch. Caleb opened up to me about his challenges with his job and how he was trying to juggle it with his personal life. I listened, and I could tell he was struggling. Then, as I was washing dishes, I felt Caleb's hand on my shoulder. It was a light touch, and it made me feel warm and comfortable. I looked up, and I could see he was feeling the same things. I could see the quiet longing in his eyes, and I could tell he was feeling a lot. I was speechless. I don't know how to respond. I am not sure how to put this, Mrs. Caldwell, but I sense something between us. I can't ignore it, even though I'm not sure what it is. My pulse was racing with a mix of astonishment and panic. I wanted to reject it or dismiss it as insignificant, but I knew that would be a lie. I looked at him, observing the vulnerability in his expression. I'm not sure how to put this, but I feel something between us. I can't ignore it, and it's making me nervous. I wanted to reject it or dismiss it as insignificant, but I knew that would be a lie. I looked at him and saw the same uncertainty and longing that I felt for Caleb. I replied, barely raising my voice. We can't do this. This isn't something we can pursue. He nodded, but his hand lingered on my shoulder, offering quiet reassurance that spoke to his own confusion. We stood there in silence, both grappling with the weight of our emotions. I told him that I felt the same uncertainty and longing for Caleb. I said that we can't do this, that it isn't something we can pursue. He nodded, but his hand stayed on my shoulder, and he looked confused. We stood there in silence, both of us dealing with our emotions and the fact that we had crossed a line. After a long moment, he stepped back and looked regretful. I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. You didn't? I offered him a small smile, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. We finished dinner in silence. The tension in the air was obvious, but it felt strange in a way that was, comforting. I knew that whatever had happened between us was real, but also impossible. We didn't say much, but we knew some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how tempting they might seem. In the weeks after, Caleb kept visiting, but we were more cautious and polite each time. We had this silent agreement that we'd keep it together and not do anything that could be misinterpreted. Our visits, which used to be filled with easygoing laughter and comfortable silences, became carefully orchestrated. We were both really aware of the new boundary between us, but as much as we tried, the tension was undeniable. A glance, a subtle gesture, the way our conversation sometimes drifted to quieter, more reflective topics, everything felt more intense. Each visit felt like walking a fine line between friendship and something unspoken, and I felt as though I was holding my breath, waiting for something to shift again. I found myself wishing for the ease we once had, that uncomplicated friendship that now felt lost in the growing complexity between us. One evening, as we sat in the living room discussing, we recently read the same book, and Caleb's hand touched mine. It was barely there, but it still jolted me. I was trying to ignore my feelings, but it was hard. I looked at him, and our eyes met, and it felt tender but also intense. He quickly looked away. We were both reading the same book, and Caleb's hand touched mine. It was barely there, but it still jolted me. I looked at him, and our eyes met, but he looked away quickly. The silence after that was filled with an unspoken understanding that we were both struggling to keep up our resolve. I tried to remind myself that this was just friends, but I also felt connected to these moments. Caleb brought warmth and companionship, and the idea of letting go. The silence was pretty obvious that we were both trying to keep it together, but I couldn't deny the connection we'd both formed. I tried to tell myself it was just friends, but I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. I started filling my days with different activities and plans, like joining a local gardening club. I'd go for long walks around the neighborhood to keep my mind off Caleb. But no matter how hard I tried, every time he came over, the connection between us was still as strong as ever. One Saturday, we ended up alone again, talking and laughing about something that got us both going. It was a light moment, almost carefree, but there was a tension in the air. We couldn't ignore it. I saw it in the way he looked at me and the way he smiled, as if he was trying to keep things light to ignore the bond that was growing deeper each time we met. The unspoken agreement between us felt fragile, as though it could break at any moment. We were both getting closer to a point where we had to deal with the hidden feelings. There were times when I saw him looking at me, and his face was a mystery, like he was asking himself where this was going. Every time, I felt a surge of. As time went on, I felt like we were reaching a point where we had to deal with the feelings we had been hiding. There were times when I'd see him looking at me, and his face was blank, like he was wondering where this was going too. Every time, I had a mix of feelings: excitement, fear, and guilt. I knew the feelings I was having could lead to something bad, but we didn't want that. Even though it was risky, I couldn't bring myself to end it and say the words that would finally end things between us. Every day, the tension between us got worse, and our meetings became this weird balance of holding back and wanting more. We were both keeping our distance, knowing we weren't going to cross any lines, but still feeling this connection that brought us close. It was a complicated, painful feeling. I often found myself lying awake at night, wondering how long we could keep up this delicate dance, how long we could ignore the emotion simmering beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last. We were both playing with fire, and eventually, one of us would have to pull back to make the relationship work. It was hard to imagine making that call, but I knew it was coming. As time went on, I started feeling more and more guilty. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying. I felt like I was betraying Adam's trust, my own values, and maybe even Caleb. By getting emotionally attached, I was doing something that just didn't fit in our lives and was always leading to regret. Every time I thought about cutting our ties, I felt guilty. I felt a twinge of sadness or reluctance to let go of the one thing that had made my days feel warm and meaningful, but I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I started thinking about how I felt about my feelings, trying to understand what had made me develop such an attachment. Maybe it was the loneliness I'd felt since Adam passed. A quiet ache that had settled into my life without my realizing it. Caleb had filled that void, bringing a sense of companionship and understanding that I hadn't known I was missing. But even as I acknowledged this, I understood that my feelings were inappropriate and I was risking a lot for a connection that probably wouldn't last. One night, I was sitting alone in the living room and decided it was time to deal with my feelings and figure out what I really wanted. I realized that while I liked having Caleb around, I needed him more. I realized that my loneliness was One day, I was sitting in the living room by myself, and I decided it was time to deal with my feelings and figure out what I really wanted. I realized that even though I liked having Caleb around, it was my own need for company that had led me down this path. Caleb had just been the one to fill that emptiness and make me feel comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. I decided to take some space from him to let go of the feelings I had. I decided to move on because I needed to feel better. It was a tough decision, but I knew it was the right choice. I couldn't keep living with this guilt or feeling like I was doing something wrong. I needed to find a way to feel better and stop feeling so lonely. I couldn't count on anyone else to do it for me. So, the next day, I planned to talk to Caleb and gently explain that we needed to maintain some distance to preserve the boundaries of our friendship and respect the lives we had both built. I knew that this was the only way to find peace and the only way to preserve the integrity of our relationship without crossing a line that would lead to regret. As I prepared for the conversation, I felt a mix of sadness and relief, a sense of closure that allowed me to look at the situation with a clearer mind. I knew this was a necessary step, a decision that eventually, it had helped me move forward and let go of the feelings I had. I had a quiet sense of determination, a belief that I could return to the peace and stability I once knew. Our final conversation felt bittersweet, a quiet end to something that had brought both joy and confusion into my life. When Caleb arrived that evening, I invited him in, feeling the weight of the moment, the sense that this was our goodbye. We sat in the living room, each of us conscious of the tension between us and the feelings that had been building up over the last several months. I fought to find the words to communicate all I was feeling without. I started to say, "Caleb, I don't want to hurt you or make things more complicated. I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, and I think it's best if we take some time apart. I really value our friendship, and I don't want to lose it, but I also don't want things to get more complicated." He looked at me, and his face showed understanding, but also sadness. "I get it, Mrs. Caldwell. I never wanted to cause any tension or make things hard. I felt a pang of regret and sadness in you that I hadn't expected. Caleb, you haven't done anything wrong. It's just that I think I got too attached. I need to take a step back and focus on finding peace within myself." He nodded, and for a moment, we were both silent, acknowledging that our meetings were ending. This marked the end of a significant chapter filled with unsaid emotions. "I'll miss you," he said, barely more than a whisper. I said, "I'll miss you too." I felt a lump in my throat, but I knew it was for the best. It's what we both needed. We looked at each other for a long, silent moment, processing the finality of the moment and the realization that this was goodbye. I felt a bunch of emotions: relief, sadness, and quiet gratitude for the connection we had shared, even if it had been brief and complex. As Caleb rose to reflections, he gave me a gentle hug and a warm, comforting embrace that felt like a farewell to everything we had shared. When the door closed behind him, I felt empty, like there was this emptiness in my chest, and it was sort of sad. But I also felt strong and at peace, like I hadn't in weeks. I felt like we had made the right decision, and we both took a step toward keeping our lives, values, and integrity. In the days after, I found myself thinking about it. Ali thought a lot about our connection and the emotions that had threatened to pull us apart. I realized that while our connection had been intense, it was also a reminder of the importance of boundaries and the need to protect the relationships that define us. I missed Caleb's presence, but I knew that ending things had been the right choice. It was a decision that would allow me to move forward with a sense of clarity and purpose. As I looked towards the future, I felt a quiet determination to find peace within myself, to heal the loneliness that had led me down this path, and to embrace the lessons I had